Last week, I posted some analytical videos treating Arnold Schoenberg's first string quartet, completed in 1905 and published as his Opus 7. As I indicated there, the first string quartet is regarded by many as the composer's first mature composition, the first to display what would become his signature polyphonic style. It would still be a few years before his break with common practice tonality, and on his way to that watershed, he continued to refine his approach to the construction of large musical forms. The first string quartet is a single movement composition, yet the presence within it of the four movements of the standard symphonic cycle is quite evident. The first chamber symphony, the natural next step in an examination of Schoenberg's music generally, represents further progress in that direction. I want to begin my treatment of this work by dropping back a century from 1907, when the chamber symphony was completed, to recount certain musical developments that culminated in the composition at hand. By Beethoven's generation, a rising concern can be noted in the works of major composers that multi-movement works, such as symphonies, concertos, and string quartets, be regarded and experienced as one thing, not three or four. We can see this ideal emerging by two means: the cyclic return of themes from earlier movements in later ones, which has the effect of drawing the work together, and in the presentation of movements without pause, sometimes achieved by means of functional bridge passages. Both of these innovations can be found in works before Beethoven's time. For instance, Joseph Haydn gave us an early example of cyclic return in his 46th Symphony, and C.P.E. Bach had organized his 4 symphonies in 12 obligatory parts to achieve continuity between 3 movements connected by bridge passages, and thus played without pause. But a more focused, intentional thrust toward the realization of this ideal really began when music started becoming almost a species of literature, with the onset of musical romanticism, and it is then that we get more notable specimens of both of these approaches. In his 9th Symphony, Beethoven gave us a famous example of cyclic return at the beginning of the finale, and we also see deep motivic connections between movements, not only in that symphony but in several earlier ones. This was taken to a notable extreme just 3 years after Beethoven's death, with the Idée fixe of Hector Berlioz's 1830 Symphonie Fantastique appearing in literarily significant transformations in all 5 movements. Many other examples could be cited from other early 19th century composers, including Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann. And of course, Beethoven linked movements in 2 of his middle period symphonies, the 5th and 6th, by bridge passages, so that the music is continuous across them. Plenty of other examples could be cited: Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy, Schumann's 4th Symphony, and Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, for instance. In some cases, one finds both techniques at work. This compound approach can be heard in the Schubert and Schumann works cited. But in all of these instances, the music is still very much in multiple movements, which, although they are linked for continuity, are still experienced as being somehow discrete. Later composers aimed at deeper integration, at ways of erasing the distinctions altogether. This seems to have been a foremost concern of Arnold Schoenberg, who achieved such integration in his early Verklärte Nacht, which in some respects resembles a 2-movement work collapsed into a single movement, the parts assimilated into a coherent whole that cannot be readily divided into distinct movements. And this is doubly true of the first string quartet, which retains the 4-movement symphonic plan, albeit as a kind of vestigial ghost, with those movements recognizable mainly by differences of style much more than in differences of material. In that work, one can detect a large sonata-form movement followed by a scherzo with trio, then a slow movement, and then a summary finale, finished off with a substantial modality-correcting coda to the whole. The connections are much deeper here than they are in, for instance, Schumann's Fourth Symphony. And the Chamber Symphony, completed 2 years after the first string quartet, represents the next logical step in this unfolding aesthetic project, which is why I'm treating it now. Let me describe the work's structure as I have come to understand it. First, imagine a substantial single movement work in sonata form, with the usual large divisions: an exposition setting forth multiple contrasting themes, a development that works out their differences, a recapitulation that reconciles the themes to the primary key, and a substantial coda to the whole. Now insert a scherzo and trio between the exposition and development, and a slow movement between the development and recapitulation. That seems to be the plan that Schoenberg has adopted here, and the result is a composition that cannot be experienced as a work in separate movements, although those movements are present in a vestigial way, almost like the human coccyx, which begins as a tail in early embryological development. Like the first string quartet, the first chamber symphony is constructed entirely of a handful of motives that are on the table by the time we've heard the first two themes. So it is that, as in the case of the string quartet, a motivic analysis of this chamber symphony would be extremely valuable and revealing. But such approach really lies outside my chief concern with this YouTube series, which is to open to an audience that includes listeners who may not be familiar with this work a means of grasping it, of hearing it coherently. That's why I focus on the work's structure. The analysis I present here is by no means exhaustive. It's a logical first step. I believe a thumbnail sketch of the Chamber Symphony is in order. Right at the outset, we hear three important motives that will permeate the work and draw it together. First is a brief cadential passage in an apparently broad tempo, closing on an F major chord. There follows an heraldic fanfare in rapid tempo by the first horn, a ladder of perfect fourths that will recur again and again, especially to underscore the big moments. The third motive is a much shorter cadential figure that closes, just barely, on E major, the work's primary key, and then we're off and running with the first theme group. Here there are three themes of sharply contrasting character, ranging from a hackly tune in the cello that opens the group to the epic sweep of theme 1C. This first theme group is finished with a closing argument that yields to the first transition, a long and multifaceted passage which, as we would expect, finally wins the key of A major for the beginning of the second theme. Here we have what I regard as the most beautiful music of the entire work, spun out at wonderful length and followed by a rousing closing section that brings the exposition to an emphatic, hammered conclusion in the work's subdominant key. The structural innovations begin at this point, for the music that follows that closing sounds for all the world like the beginning of the development. Some commentators, in fact, consider this the beginning of a second exposition, and those who are acquainted with the convention of false exposition repeat that sometimes open the development in works in sonata rondo form will hear something familiar in it. This surge of developmental energy soon flags, however, and gives place to transitional material that struggles arduously toward a goal that turns out to be the symphony's scherzo. What I have described so far corresponds partly to the formal approach Schoenberg took in his first string quartet, but as the Chamber Symphony is only about half as long as the quartet, I must remind you that all we've heard so far of what could be considered Movement 1 is its exposition. The development and recap are still to come. The work's scherzo is much more compact than that of its predecessor, and perhaps more entertaining as well. It is a study in manic energy and dogged imitation at tight temporal intervals, and is finished in due course with a vigorous closing that concludes with a shouted return of that ladder of fourths given by the solo horn over 6 minutes earlier, its direction now reversed, diving headlong into the music's development section. This three-part development treats all of the themes we've heard so far in a thoroughgoing way, and as its course is being finished, that stack of fourths again confirms the importance of a structural junction, both closing the development and opening the slow movement with its first long paragraph. It is in the slow movement portion of the chamber symphony that we hear the nearest approach to the literary quality of Verklärte Nacht. This music is tender, heartfelt, and probing. The slow movement ends much as it began and gives way to a retransitional passage that achieves the return of E major for the recapitulation. It is a recapitulation that serves not only to bring the return of the themes we heard during the exposition, but the scherzo and slow movement themes as well, bringing everything together under a single formal umbrella. A two-part coda summarizes the chamber symphony aptly, and the work ends brilliantly in the brightness of E major. Of course, I could say 100 more things about this wonderful work, and you'd have forgotten most of them by the time you hear the music, so I believe I'll sit down, shut up, and let Arnold Schoenberg have his say. The recording is by Riccardo Chailly and members of the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra. I'll follow up in a few days with a descriptive analysis of this work.